Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence and not authority. Still more when you superadd the tendency or the certainty of corruption by authority. There is no worse heresy than that the office sanctifies the holder of it. Lord John Dalberg Acton. You are probably already familiar with one part of that quote. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's a memorable and concise phrase to capture the overall message on the dangers of centralizing power into one authority. The full context is less known, and admittedly even I wasn't aware until researching it for this video. Lord Acton was a historian and politician from the 19th century. He wrote these famous words in a letter to the Catholic Church for the purpose of lobbying against the Papal Infallibility Decree. If you don't know what that means, it was essentially a motion from the Catholic Church to declare the Pope was always right when talking about things related to faith or morals. I think we all understand the risks of handing too much power to one person or area of government. There would be little, if anything at all, stopping that authority from acting maliciously if they really wanted to. Lord Acton's full quote, though, elaborates on the very concept of power entirely. He argues it's fundamentally a corruptive force that can and will turn even the best people into the worst. He does qualify it by saying it's a tendency and not a certainty, unless the power is absolute. Nevertheless, nobody escapes its influence and must actively avoid succumbing to corruption. Indeed, we have to hold those with power to a higher standard than the average person due to how they're constantly under corruption's threat. It's not very surprising that Lord Acton's warning survived in the public consciousness after all this time. Authoritarian governments still exist in the modern world, and the common thread between them is power concentrated to an absolute leader. We can see with our own eyes what the ramifications of absolute power look like right now. We don't even have to refer to the rigorously detailed historical accounts of past regimes, it's present today. Naturally then, if there's a phenomenon that's so prominent throughout human history, that poses real danger to human rights, and that's still relevant in modern times, artists are going to explore it. Art's role in society has always been extremely important. Not only does it provide entertainment, but while doing so, it can communicate complex ideas in a way that resonates with their target audience. If that art can reach enough people, then perhaps a difference in the world can truly be made. Well, maybe that's setting expectations a bit high, but it's a nice idea at least. With that preface out of the way, it's finally time to talk about video games. If you've already played Final Fantasy Tactics, then that whole spiel shouldn't have been surprising. If you haven't, it's a game with a story deeply about the insidious nature of power and the effects it has on society. The goal today is to engage with that story on a deeper level. I'm claiming the game is about power already, but what is it really trying to say? What are its themes and messages, and what tools does it use to communicate them? Before we truly begin, a few disclaimers. First, I'd like to offer a content warning, since this game is a little different from what I've covered so far on the channel. Final Fantasy Tactics takes place during a civil war, which means a lot of the subjects of the story are inherently political. On top of that, the game is heavily critical of religion, and uses a Christianity analog as a framework for talking about it. I'm not here to lecture you on politics or religion, and there won't be any direct references to current events in this video, but if these subjects are sensitive to you, I won't blame you for passing on this one. That said, I encourage you to think for yourself about what Final Fantasy Tactics is arguing. If you agree with it, why? If not, why not? Of course, I'm only human, so whatever analysis I make about what the game is saying will be based on my interpretation of the story, which is influenced by whatever biases I might have. If you disagree, that's totally fine. I only ask that everyone stays respectful. Sound good? If so, then here is your one and only spoiler warning. We will be spoiling the entirety of Final Fantasy Tactics, from the bosses we fight to the ending of the story. Lastly, I chose to play the Ivalice Chronicles version of the game that was released in 2025, so the analysis will be concentrated on that. I've never played the original, so if there are nuances in the story that are different from what you remember, that's probably why. Alright, we're now ready to begin. Welcome to Final Fantasy Tactics. The first thing we need to make abundantly clear is that our setting, the Kingdom of Ivalice, is a divided one. There are two groups of people that are fundamentally at odds with each other. Both sides seek to put down the other for the sake of getting more power for their own side. They insult, sabotage, and even kill each other. Of course, I'm talking about the upper and lower classes. Final Fantasy Tactics is very explicit with its themes and messaging around classism. You've seen fantasy medieval settings before, right? You're probably used to seeing the divide of peasants living in the slums and working all day while the nobles live in their posh castles sipping on tea. Ivalice is no different in this regard, but the game doesn't hold back when it comes to discussing the implications of this societal structure. Our protagonist, Ramza, is a member of the ruling class. He's a noble by blood to an important family and has never known life without such status before the game begins. It's also true that he is a kind person who does his best to resolve issues peacefully and prioritizes saving lives whenever possible. Part of his admirable perspective comes from his proximity to Delita, a commoner who was taken in by Ramza's father. The two are around the same age, so they grew up together and were close. Ramza's kind heart doesn't suddenly make the fact that he starts the game by serving the ruling class and perpetuating inequality go away, however. Chapter 1 of Final Fantasy Tactics is all about making us feel as horrible as possible. The main antagonist of this era is the Corpse Brigade. They're a revolutionary group that seek to change society for the better, having been formed from commoner veterans that never got their compensation for fighting in the 50 Years' War. They want to upend the entire system so all classes of people can become equal, and it's kind of hard to find fault in their motivations, at least. While they only target members of the nobility, their actions are absolutely violent, and they aren't unified at every level. There are some bad actors in the group that only seek to elevate their own position in society rather than change it for everyone. As a result, I'm not endorsing the Corpse Brigade entirely, but I don't think we're meant to either. What I believe we're supposed to do, though, as we slaughter more of its members through Chapter 1, is wonder, what choice did these people have? Were they meant to live lives of suffering, working themselves to the bone endlessly just to put food on their table every night? How can we expect them to feel about the ruling class when the nobility took what they rightfully earned away from them, even though they were the ones who risked their lives in the war? Is it really that surprising when they begin to lash out violently? We're meant to sympathize with their situation, and that's why it all just feels wrong, especially when we fight Miluda and Wiegraf. I was conscious in my choice of words there, by the way. I said sympathize and not empathize, and that's because a big theme of the game is that it's impossible to truly empathize with the lower class if you haven't lived in it. If you personally have lived in true poverty, then you get a pass for empathy, but if you were fortunate enough to avoid it, then sympathy is the correct word here for the themes of the game. All of the antagonists mock Ramza for claiming to understand them, even though he's a noble. With how the nobility treated the commoners that fought in the 50 Years' War especially, again, who can blame them for having this inherent distrust? But maybe it's not that bad. Maybe the Corpse Brigade really is overdoing it. Ramza, after all, wants to find a peaceful solution. He genuinely doesn't want to fight Miluda, but she understandably, yet tragically, doesn't trust him. Not all of the nobles are truly bad people, right? Maybe if we just all put our weapons down and talked and negotiated, we could end this conflict and improve society. That sounds a lot better than violent rebellions, right? Well, that's where Argath comes in. Argath might be the best character in the entire game, and I mean that completely unironically. It's not that he's super complex or anything, he's actually very simple, but rather how expertly crafted his role in the story is. Argath is the first person Ramza saves while acting as an official knight. That first tangible instance of saving someone's life is bound to leave a lasting impact on a kind soul like Ramza, right? It's also going to bias us, the player, to trust him. We saw him truly vulnerable and we saved his life. Ever hear how doing a favor for someone makes you subconsciously like them more? Your brain thinks something like, if I'm helping this person, it must be because I like them. That principle applies here. Our introduction to Argath is purposefully constructed to get us to have a positive first impression of him. As such, Ramza is inclined to give Argath the benefit of the doubt at every opportunity, even as Argath slowly reveals his true colors. A nobleman that despises commoners. He's more or less a caricature of an upperclassman, but to both Ramza and the player, he's an ally and partner. Even though Ramza disagrees with Argath's beliefs, he tolerates him and keeps him around, likely because of that initial positivity. The tension between Argath and Delita grows with time, but Ramza constantly acts as the mediator. He wants everyone to get on the same side, but that is unfortunately not how this world works. Ramza is very naive at this point in the game. All that talk about finding a peaceful resolution with the Corpse Brigade is just a fantasy. He doesn't have a full picture of how the world really functions since he grew up sheltered as a nobleman. He doesn't fully grasp the sheer vitriol people like Argath have toward people like Delita. An important nuance in this whole situation is that Delita was essentially adopted into the noble life. He learned noble customs, traditions, and manners, and has been accepted by House Beowulf. The same is true for his sister, Titra. You would never know from the outside that Delita and Titra were born as commoners, which is exactly why Titra ends up being kidnapped and used as a hostage. The kidnappers can't tell she has common blood. She dresses in noble clothes. There's no inherent difference between Titra and a noblewoman. It all has to do with their presentation. The same is true for Argath and Delita. Argath makes no complaints when Delita helps save his life, for instance, and he's very grateful toward both him and Ramza initially. There's nothing tangible that Argath can point to that causes disdain for the lower class. Let me clarify that even if Delita were raised purely as a commoner and acted like one, it still wouldn't be justification for Argath's mentality. The important part is that Argath doesn't even have anything he can pretend is a valid reason for disliking Delita. It's just pure prejudice based on blood he can't see, and it's awful. We're meant to grow increasingly uncomfortable with Argath, and as Ramza does his best to make peace, we'll likely realize before Ramza that no amount of compromise will work. Argath also serves another role in the narrative, beyond being an embodiment of horrible classist mentality. I would argue Final Fantasy Tactics uses Argath as a tool to demonstrate a pitfall of centrism. You can't meet in the middle with irrational hatred. Now, sometimes it's true that there are two sides in a situation that take things to an extreme end, and the best solution is somewhere in the middle. However, how would you negotiate with someone who wholeheartedly believes that an entire class of people is subhuman and should be treated as cattle? What's the compromise here to make everyone sufficiently happy? Ramza's attempt at doing so is just to keep the peace. Because Argath and Delita are in the same army, they have some common ground they can focus on instead of their differences, and Ramza tries to point them in that direction. The problem here is that this is a very logical, practical route to take, but Argath's prejudice isn't based on anything logical. It's entirely emotional, and that's not being addressed at all. His resentment is only going to grow stronger with time. I'll reiterate that Delita saving Argath's life wasn't enough for him, so there's no way that he would learn they're not so different if they just kept working together. It all comes to a head when Argath suggests leaving Titra to die because a commoner isn't worth saving. Ramza is rightfully furious and finally kicks Argath out of his group, but the damage has been done to his relationship with Delita. Because Ramza tolerated Argath for so long, Delita finds it really hard to give Ramza the benefit of the doubt in the future and ridicules himself for ever considering Ramza a friend. And who can blame him? Argath is a representation of how attempting to compromise with abject hate leads to the destruction of social groups. That's also why it's so important for Argath to be the one that kills Titra. The kidnappers only took Titra because they thought she was a real member of the nobility, and the kidnappers only targeted nobility because of how the nobility treated them. Regardless of who actually shot the arrow, her murder would be a direct consequence of the nobility's actions, but Argath is the one to do it to really hammer the message in. As it stands, the ruling class is rotten to the core and can't be negotiated with. Even the ones we think aren't too bad. Ramza's older brother, Zalbog, who acted pretty reasonably up until this point, is the one who gives the order for Argath to shoot Titra. By the end of Chapter 1, we likely hate our allies more than we ever did our enemies. I'm sure you can extrapolate how all this might be relevant in today's world. A major reason why someone would be inclined to commit a crime is if they feel they have no other option. The majority of people don't want to break the social contract, or I'd like to believe that at least. I don't think anyone could say Maluda or Regraf are deranged criminals. They're just trying to survive in a world that's hostile to them, and they hope to make the world less hostile for those who come after. How do we solve this issue? Well, I'm sorry, but I don't know. Sorry to disappoint you. I know you may have been expecting to find a solution to global poverty in this Final Fantasy Tactics video essay, but I tried thinking really hard and just couldn't figure it out. Alright, seriously though, this is like one of the most important political issues of today. I sure as hell don't know the best way to fix it, and neither does Final Fantasy Tactics really. It definitely raises some ideas for approaches, but none of the systemic issues raised by the game are resolved by the end of it. The upper and lower class distinction still exists, and there's also a whole other area of discussion around the church and religion that we haven't even gotten into yet. The game is not primarily here to propose a solution, but rather show the consequences if a solution isn't found. A cautionary tale, if you will. Actually, while we're talking about how the game ends, I'd like to ask a question. Whose perspective do we follow in Final Fantasy Tactics? Careful now. The immediate reaction would be to say Ramza, obviously, but that's not the framing of the story. In-universe, Final Fantasy Tactics is told to the player by a scholar named Lam hundreds of years in the future. It's easy to forget that the narrator is an actual distinct character in this game, but even that's not fully correct. The story of Ramza was written by Oran, one of Ramza's allies that he meets later in his quest. He sought to tell the world the truth of how the War of the Lions went down. Oran's story was considered heresy, and he was executed for it. Lam, Oran's descendant, only uncovered these forbidden manuscripts centuries later. I'm bringing this up because I'd like to ask another question. Why frame the story in this way at all? You could easily cut these details from the game and just have an omniscient, faceless narrator without affecting anything, really. The game mostly plays like that already, since Lam only comes up at the very beginning and the very end. In fact, they probably lead to the game having a less satisfying conclusion than it otherwise would have. The preface tells us that Delita was remembered as the hero of the war and Ramza was lost to time as a rogue heretic. Oran's papers let us know that Ramza was secretly the real hero. That creates initial intrigue since we're interested to learn why this happened, so that's fine. I'm mainly talking about the ending reel when the main conflict is happily resolved. We just get spit in the face essentially with a reminder that Ramza's heroism was never acknowledged and his supporters were unceremoniously executed. I would hope a story doesn't do this without good reason for it. And, well, I think there is one. What I think is the critical detail doesn't actually have to do much with Ramza or Oran. It's how Delita was remembered as the war's hero. We, the player, see what Delita is actually like. He's morally grey through and through. He lies, cheats, and kills without hesitation if it would serve his agenda. His real goals are left a mystery for most of the game, but what we're told with certainty is that he's only loyal to himself. He eventually reveals his plan to Oran that he wants to create a legend out of himself. A commoner that rises through the ranks, amassing more and more power until he ultimately becomes king of his own merit. Let's put a bookmark here. We don't have enough information to properly analyze the thematic purpose of Delita yet, which I guess is fitting for how enigmatic he is throughout the game. I wanted to bring it up now though, since the game tells us in advance that Delita really did become a legend. All that scheming paid off exactly as planned. Just keep that knowledge in the back of your mind for now. We'll return later. I want to shift gears and start talking about the Church of Glabados. As a quick refresher, they control the main religion of Ivalice and serve as a third party in the kingdom's civil war. They were actually part of the conspiracy that started it all, though. The church aimed to fuel the fires between Duke Larg and Duke Goltana to trigger the conflict. Once it was well underway, the church planned to swoop in and broker peace so the church would regain the people's faith and loyalty. To do that, the church sought to recreate the holy legend of Saint Ajora and the Zodiac Braves. Everyone knew the stories of the scriptures, so if the church got representatives apparently blessed by the divine, then anyone who believes in their religion, which happens to be most of the kingdom's population, would follow them. The church is presented as the most powerful institution in Ivalice, and we see that demonstrated in many different ways. Ramza fights against every faction in the war, but the title and charges that actually stick to him is that of a heretic. Both sides of the civil war practice the same religion. Neither side wants to be associated with a heretic. The church is also the one who puts the biggest bounty on Ramza's head. Several bandit attacks in the game only happen because they recognize Ramza from his wanted posters for heresy. And also, as we just talked about, Ramza is remembered by history as a heretic. Now let's think about why that might be. If you're well versed in real-world history, then this is a layup question. You might know that the Catholic Church was arguably the most powerful institution in Europe during the Middle Ages, and the Church of Glabados takes quite a lot after it. I mean, think about the story of Saint Ajora. He was an alleged child of God, had a dozen disciples, was eventually betrayed by one of them, was ultimately executed by the state because he threatened the old dominant religion, and finally became a martyr that started a new one. This is literally the story of Jesus Christ in the Bible. It's not even a little bit subtle. Despite this setup, though, I don't think Final Fantasy Tactics is singling out Christianity for criticism. It could have been any other religion in theory, but Jesus Christ's apostles line up nicely with the Zodiacs, and the Catholic Church fits the game's medieval European-esque setting. Christianity is also not largely practiced in Japan, and we have to keep in mind this is a Japanese game. I could be wrong, but I get the feeling that it was just a convenient framework to talk about religion in general. I do think it was important that a real-world religion was used as the framework, though. To explain why, we need to establish two things. First, the story of Saint Ajora as told by the Church is a complete fabrication. In reality, Ajora was a mortal man purposefully sowing disruption in the old Adoran Empire, and his disciples, the Zodiac Braves, didn't defeat demons, they were the demons, the Lucavi. Ajora himself was also possessed by a Lucavi, the most powerful one, Ultima, and the resurrected Ajora Ultima fusion is the final boss of the game. Second, religion is fundamentally not based on logic. That's not a criticism or anything, I'm just speaking literally. Religion is formed off of faith, not logic. No one can logically prove or disprove that God or any other higher being exists. Religious followers simply have faith that there is something else out there. Now, consider the following. What would happen if a malicious group were to create a religion? If they could convince people to believe in them, maybe by faking or lying about divine miracles, then they suddenly have a group of people that's willing to suspend logical thought and believe their every word. The malicious group could then construct the details of their mythology in any way that suits their agenda. Since the followers believe through faith, they're very likely to just accept this without question. For example, the figurehead of this religion could write into its false scriptures that everyone must give them half their income to reach salvation. Do you see what I'm getting at? Religion is perhaps the most dangerous tool used by those in power to maintain their control. If used maliciously, it preys on people's goodwill, and has a layer of insulation unlike anything else. It's much harder to convince someone that their faith is misaligned than that their logic is wrong. That's the thematic reason why the Church of Glabados is presented as the most powerful faction in the war, beyond just being modeled after the historical Catholic Church. More importantly, it's also the reason why the Ajora story had to look like a real religion. It's possible for every religion in the world to be used like Ajora's. We should, by default, be highly suspicious of any institution of power attempting to use religion as justification for their actions. Again, I'm not here to argue against religion in general, and if you are a believer, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. What I am arguing against, and what I also believe Final Fantasy Tactics to be arguing against, is the fusion of church and state. If the state can hide behind divine providence, then it's much harder to hold them accountable for violating human rights or consolidating power. You've likely heard about the idea of separation of church and state before, but maybe this framing with Final Fantasy Tactics can help you better appreciate its value. Alright, I think it's finally time to address the elephant in the room. Our major topics so far of classism, religion, and Delita are, in reality, just tools or symptoms of the underlying issue Final Fantasy Tactics seeks to address: the concept of power in its entirety. Every single antagonist in the game has something in common. They're seeking power. Some aim to become the single most powerful entity, amassing as much as they can by whatever means necessary. Some feel power is what they're rightfully owed, and seek more to achieve the status they crave. There are even some that want power because they genuinely aim to change society for the better. All of these antagonists have something else in common. They all become Lucavi. Fulmarv, Dystarg, and Wiegraf are the antagonists that best embody power as a corruptive force. While they aren't the only Lucavi in the game, and there are even other non-Lucavi antagonists, I think the three of them demonstrate the danger of power better than anyone else. They also tie in nicely with a lot of the ideas presented by Lord Acton's famous quote that we began with. Let's start with Fulmarv. While he's the main antagonist and second to last boss of the game, I think he's actually the simplest to talk about. He represents absolute power corrupting absolutely. Fulmarv is single-minded in gaining more power throughout the game, resorting to any tactic imaginable to do so. He tells his daughter that he is a manifestation of pure, unadulterated power, and honestly, he's right. He hides his true ambitions from even his most loyal followers, and he plays into people's perception of him as the second coming of Saint Ajora to manipulate them. He even goes as far as killing his own son for the sake of more power, only regretting that his son wasn't strong enough to become a Lucavi. His endgame is to resurrect Ultima and create a world where the Lucavi collectively reign supreme, foregoing all humans. That's about as much power as one could have. The nuance with Fulmarv comes from how we never actually see him when he's not possessed. He's a Lucavi from the start of the game, so you could argue that his thirst for power is just a result of the Lucavi's influence. But he had to have become a Lucavi in the first place. Something drove him to use a Zodiac Stone, even if he wasn't as completely heartless originally. My guess is he always had this innate drive for power and fell for the sweet temptations of the stone. And you know, the fact that he's always been possessed is rather interesting thematically. We can all agree that becoming a Lucavi is a bad thing, right? You might have already guessed that I'm arguing from the angle that when someone succumbs to the Lucavi, it's a symbol of how they've been completely corrupted by power. And, well, that's exactly what I'm doing. With that in mind, consider that Fulmarv, the character in the game that pursues absolute power, is the one that's corrupted absolutely. There's not a single trace of the original person left. This is what the drive for power looks like when it's taken to its extreme end, as Lord Acton forewarned. What about Dystark? Surprisingly, he's not too different from Fulmarv by the end, but his origin has a pretty important distinction. So, just as a reminder, Dystark was probably the person trying the hardest to spark the Civil War, even more than the Church of Glabados. The first 2 chapters of the game are more or less just Ramza catching wind of Dystark's schemes and stopping them without ever knowing Dystark was behind them. He was trying so hard to begin the war because he saw an opportunity. His noble house, House Beowulf, could fill the power vacuum in the kingdom and take control. He secretly poisoned his father to death, because as the eldest son, he would become the head of House Beowulf. Just like Fulmarv, nothing was beneath him. He sacrifices Tetra and Duke Larg with no remorse, and he ends up being our last opponent before the final boss rush, becoming a Lucavi in the process. Dystark's mentality and relationship with power is the hardest to narrow down, but I think he's a great example of how both forms of power described by Lord Acton, influence and authority, lead to corruption regardless of circumstance. Dystark and Ramza's father, Lord Barbaneth, was a great man that taught his children chivalry and respect. He taught them that those with power must be righteous of heart, otherwise they don't deserve to hold authority. We can even see some of Barbaneth's teachings remain in Dystark's mind early in the game, when he tells Ramza that adherence to the rule of law is a knight's solemn duty. It falls upon us, as Beowulfs, to bear the burden of example. As we learn later, Dystark does not follow his own advice. With all this in mind of how Dystark grew up comfortably with a father that taught the right lessons, how did it go so wrong? Well, as the eldest son of a respected noble family, Dystark certainly held influence, right? They're not even just regular old nobles. Barbaneth was a venerated war hero that got credited for helping end the 50 Years' War. People are absolutely going to listen to Barbaneth's eldest son. Whatever influence Dystark held, though, would pale in comparison to what he could have as head of House Beowulf. Once that was in his grasp, his influence expanded, and he got a layer of authority he didn't have before. He then became more and more obsessed with gaining power, believing it to be his right, and in general believing it was the right of the powerful to rule over the weak. It's true we don't see Dystark in his younger years, so maybe he never truly listened to his father's teachings, but I interpret him more as someone whose values corroded over time. It makes sense to me that he would start by modeling after his father, but when he got a taste of real influence, he became addicted and craved more. That would explain how his more rational, honorable side slipped out a bit when disciplining Ramza early in the game. That person really existed at one point. Symbolically, you could even say Dystark slowly and secretly poisoning his father over time is a representation of what happened to his mindset. If Barbaneth represents using power for good, then Dystark's poisoning of him represents unchecked power slowly corrupting a once honorable mind. I want to talk a little bit more about Dystark's claims of it being the right of the powerful to rule over the weak. Let's humor this idea for a little bit, and think about what its ramifications would be if we started a society on this principle. We'd have to begin by dividing everyone into either being powerful or weak. That by default creates an upper and lower class. The upper class would be able to do whatever they want to the lower class, since it'd be their right. They'd have all the power, which means they'd have all the resources, which means they'd get all the money. Whoops, we've reinvented classism by barely trying. Okay, let's do that one more time. Let's say there was a fair competition to determine the powerful and the weak. Everyone had access to equal resources, and the ones deemed powerful won of their own merit. Great! It's harder to complain about that since, well, everyone had an equal chance at winning, and those with genuinely better skill won out. The two classes are created again, but it's a skill issue this time. What happens in the next generation, though? The children of the powerful are going to have access to the resources of the powerful. The weak get no such benefit. Is it the right of the powerful families to hoard resources for future generations? They did earn it, after all. Why shouldn't they be allowed to provide for their kids? And, well, this is pretty reasonable, actually. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and if anything, it's pretty admirable to use your success to provide a better future for the next generation. The problem comes when there's no feasible ability for the lower class to reach this level of success. Generational advantages compound over time, which makes the gap grow wider if there's nothing done about it. What should be done? I couldn't tell you an approach that would make everyone happy, but what I do know is if nothing is done, you create people like Wheatgraph. Wheatgraph becoming a Lucavi is a representation of Lord Acton's idea of great men almost always being bad men. I actually think it's less to do with Wheatgraph specifically and more so the Corpse Brigade as a whole. He's just the face of it, so he gets the Lucavi treatment. We've already talked about them a lot, so I won't get into it all again, but I'll reiterate the Corpse Brigade was founded by commoners that were exploited by the nobility. They felt they had no other option, so they turned to violence. These acts of violence, though, gave them a feeling of power. For once, the commoners felt like they had an advantage over the nobility. They could terrorize them. Even though they had sympathizable reasons for doing so, and even though they may have really wanted to change things for the better, they, too, aren't immune to power's corruptive influence. All the infighting in the group from people who sought to elevate their own status in society instead of changing society as a whole is a good showcase of what I mean. They realized the power the Corpse Brigade gave them, and they saw a chance to use it to get more power on an individual level, rather than use their power to level the playing field for everyone else. Alright, we've talked about a lot of ideas already, but there really hasn't been many shreds of hope in there. Obviously, in real life, we live in a world where some groups of people hold more power than others. If power is inherently corruptive, as both Lord Acton and Final Fantasy Tactics claim, then that doesn't bode well for us, does it? What can we do then? I know I said the game is more of a cautionary tale than a how to fix the world's problems guide, but it does give some ideas at least. Unfortunately, we have one more unresolved thread to handle before we can talk about those. Remember that bookmark we placed? Let's go back there. We have what we need to finish discussing Delita now. Delita's rise to power is very similar to what Fulmarv and Dicedarg do throughout the game. All his lying, scheming, murdering, and general willingness to use anyone as a pawn to advance his agenda. The difference between them and Delita, though, is that Delita was remarkably restrained. He made a point to only do what he believed to be absolutely necessary. If there was someone trying to interfere with his agenda, and killing them would make his life a lot easier, that still wouldn't be a good enough reason to do it. We see that when Delita spares Valmafra's life, even though she was ready to assassinate him. He needs to be convinced there really is no other way forward to take any action at all. The result of this behavior is that Delita, from an outside perspective, hadn't dirtied his hands. He did everything the right way. He rose through military might and became a genuine lover of the proclaimed rightful queen Ovelia, making him king via completely legitimate methods. No one without insider knowledge would know of how much Delita manipulated behind the scenes to make this a reality. That builds his legend as a true motivational story of a commoner rising to the throne, leading to him being remembered by history as the hero of the War of the Lions. And what did that get him? It got him this. Betrayed by Ovelia and stabbed to death just as his reign was starting. Meanwhile, Ramza and his sister Alma got to live out peaceful lives for the rest of their days after saving the world from the Lucavi. Their legacies are pretty opposite to how they ended up, aren't they? What is the reason for this, thematically speaking? The problem with Delita, and why his story ends in his abrupt death, is that none of the actions of his so-called legend actually had a tangible benefit. It's hard to say if he truly thought he was making a difference in the world by providing proof upward mobility is possible for the lower class, or if he just succumbed to the idea of obtaining more power, but the truth of the matter is he did nothing to change the systems of the world. The only impact his actions had was giving himself more power. I mean, think about it. What is a commoner supposed to think when they hear about Delita? Oh, I just need to become a war hero and marry a queen to escape poverty? I mean, clearly it works, but it's a little easier said than done. If anything, Delita only emboldened the status quo by giving the powers that be, in this case the church, someone they can point to as a justification to not improve anything for the lower class. After all, a commoner made it all the way to Delita's position in the same societal state, so why are you complaining? Ignore that Delita had a unique set of circumstances, including noble education and military training from being adopted by a noble family. He was born a commoner, and he became king. That's good enough. That's why the church jumped on the opportunity to proclaim Delita the hero of the war. It draws attention away from the heretic Ramza, all while reinforcing the state of the world. Okay, now it's finally time to talk about those ideas of how we can respond to power's corruption. The first is kind of self-explanatory, and we've already glossed over it a bit before. Those with power have a responsibility to use it for good in whatever way they reasonably can. It's what Barbaneth Beowulf taught his children, and it's what Ramza actually puts into practice throughout the game. It's a lot easier for those who already have power to take advantage of it and enact change, rather than having to go through the step of the disenfranchised people gaining power on their own and doing it themselves. Ideally, those disenfranchised people would eventually gain that power too, but this is just kind of the first step. The second ties in pretty heavily to the framing of the story. What is Ramza's greatest weapon in the war? Is it his raw strength? His kindness? His noble status? His friends? As heroic as some of those sound, the answer is none of the above. It's the scriptures of Germanique, the text that proves Saint Ajora was no saint at all. This is the real leverage Ramza is able to use in the game. It's the one thing that can truly threaten the people in power because it undermines their faith-based insulation. The funny thing about it is that it's essentially just a history textbook, or at least a book that describes what actually happened. Now let's think about this detail in combination with how history was written after the war. The church was able to suppress the knowledge and labeled Ramza an unimportant heretic for centuries. They even executed Oran, who also held the knowledge of the truth. The church won in the long run by controlling information. Final Fantasy Tactics is showing us the importance of remembering history. In today's day and age, without state interference, the average person has the incredible ability to compare present government actions to those of historical regimes. Authoritarian governments do everything they can to censor harmful information or propagandize it somehow, and that's because they know people won't idly sit by if they knew the truth. If they're blissfully ignorant or manipulated, though, then, well, you know what they say about those who don't learn from history? They're doomed to repeat it. Alright, what have we learned today? Final Fantasy Tactics is about many important issues, including classist discrimination and malicious use of religion, but at the heart of it all is power. It's the immovable force that drives inequality and creates dictatorships. No one can truly stop its influence. It's an eternally relevant topic, so I'm sure you were able to connect at least one aspect of what we talked about today to whatever is currently happening in the country you live in. I don't have any big requests of you this time, nor am I going to make your big takeaway for you. As I said at the beginning, I encourage you to engage with the game and what we've discussed on your own for a bit. For example, do you agree that people with power have a responsibility to use it for good? If so, how can we make this happen? If you believe yourself to have some level of power, are you fulfilling that responsibility? It's these types of questions that I can't answer for you. Final Fantasy Tactics is the kind of game where you either have to be really young or covering your eyes and ears to not understand it's trying to talk about really important stuff. I'm just the wingman here, so now it's your turn to get to talking with the game. I hope you two hit it off. We have now finally reached the end. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so I can make more videos like these. If you particularly liked this video and would like to support me directly, you can also consider becoming a channel member. You'll get access to a super secret member zone in our channel Discord, and starting with the next video, you'll be added to a member shoutout section at the end. Before we truly end, there are a couple of things I wanted to mention that didn't quite fit anywhere in the script. First, you could absolutely find insight by analyzing the role of women in Final Fantasy Tactics. Many of the female characters have their agency stripped from them, and sexism is a topic that gets brought up a couple of times. For example, Alma anguishes over being born a woman and not being in a position to help Ramza in his fight. There's also Gafgarian's and Agrius's battle conversation in Chapter 2 that brings up stereotypes about women's role in society. This subject didn't really flow with the main script, so I chose not to bring it up, but I wanted to acknowledge that it's present. Second, this video was actually a first for me. You see, I was already greatly familiar with every game I've covered so far on the channel, but I had never played Final Fantasy Tactics before making this video. All the footage you see is from my first playthrough of the game. I had heard its story was really good before playing it, so I figured I'd record my gameplay just in case. With it being so fresh and new in my mind, I kind of want to articulate my thoughts on the game in a general sense too. My favorite aspect was easily the story, and it kept me engaged for the entire duration. I did think it slipped a little bit when one of the Zodiac Stones got used to revive Marek though. I'm not fully sure why that was even included, since the idea of them being used for good isn't ever expanded upon. It's a relatively small blemish though. On the positive side of things, I think my favorite part of the story is the climax of Chapter 1, where Argath abruptly kills Tetra. Well, that's not really positive, but I really wasn't kidding when I said I thought Argath was the best character in the game. I hate him so much. Gameplay-wise, it took me a long time to get used to. My experience with tactics games pretty much begins and ends with Fire Emblem, so having an attack bar system as well as really small maps and army sizes took a lot of adjustment. Once I got the hang of it, it was really fun, albeit kind of grindy. I especially like the system of dead allies being able to be revived, but having a time limit on it. It created so many tense moments when I decided to gamble on my ability to finish the map before they disappeared forever. I'm not too big a fan of the generic units filling the army though. Since you start with only generics, I had no choice but to invest in them, and if I was already investing in them, I didn't really want to replace them for one of the actual characters later in the game. I only really ended up using Agrias and occasionally Cid. I know Cid just kind of eclipses Agrias, but I had spent so many resources on her that it felt wrong to ditch her, and I didn't feel like grinding to get Cid all the skills I had already gotten for Agrias. All in all, I thought it was a really cool game. I don't know if it makes my personal favorites list, but I definitely would recommend it to people. Also, while I don't have a frame of reference to the original, I thought all the quality of life features in the remaster were excellent. The voice acting was great too. Alright, that's it for real. Thank you once again for watching, and see you next time.